as possible because it is another full session. Thank you all for coming. My name is Don Downey. I'm NESAF treasurer and chaired the programming committee this year. I'll be moderating this session. Not going to waste much time. Kosiba is a forest ecophysiologist and extension assistant professor of forestry at UVM. As the state extension forester, she creates resources and conducts applied research to help landowners, foresters, and decision makers better understand the impacts of climate change and other stressors on Vermont's forests and management techniques to improve carbon benefits and forest resilience. Let's welcome Kosiba.
Keep me on track. Okay. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. This is an impressive sized crowd. This is great. I will say Emma Sass asked me to do this talk before, then I got roped into a lot of the planning of this conference. So the last couple of days have been stressful, but it's great that everything is going so well. So I'm going to be talking about threats and risk assessment, really thinking about understanding, but also communicating forest vulnerability to climate change. And so in the work I do, I work a lot with professionals as well as landowners, kind of thinking about having a lens of climate change in their forest management stewardship. And so this is sort of work that I'm developing as resources and guidance to help folks think about how do you really assess threats and risks, and how do you communicate that with folks that need that. So when we talk about forest vulnerability, it is the degree to which a forest is susceptible to be affected by the adverse effects of climate change. And what we know is that different forest conditions, different stressors, past land use history, past management, all those things can make vulnerability more or less. And so that's really important to think about this as a site-specific, a stand-specific metric, right? There's no one-size-fits-all management technique to reduce vulnerability, and so that goes to thinking about risks and threats. We do have this sort of like schematic to think about vulnerability, and this comes from a series of reports as well as the New England Vulnerability Assessment. And so we have this kind of idea of potential impacts where you have exposure. So exposure is the sum of the climate and climate-related changes that may affect the forest. Then you have sensitivity, which is really the degree to which the forest will be affected by climate change. So those together are really that potential impact that might happen. But then you also have this adaptive capacity component that can lessen that potential impact by allowing the forest to adjust to those changes, to that impact. And together you get the vulnerability of that forest. And so again, like really thinking about and communicating this idea that it is site and condition specific to the forest that you're working at. And just to really paint this picture of how important this is to communicate, I find with the work I do that landowners, they're really concerned about disturbances to their forest. They're really concerned about climate change. I think a lot of it comes from fear, they're scared, they're uncertain about the future, and this is data from the National Woodlands Owner Survey. This is the Northeast region, which is larger than New England here, but goes down the eastern seaboard a little bit. Landowners greater than 1 acre in size, and you can see that 90% of folks are worried about insects and disease, have high level of concern, right? High to moderate level. Climate change is about 80% of those folks. Right? Wind, ice storms, invasive plants, all of these things we know are going to be exacerbated, or climate change will multiply their effects, right? We know that with things like invasive plants, we'll see likely more and new novel infestations of invasive plants as the climate warms. So when we think about site-specific vulnerabilities, there's sort of like two buckets, right? There's the forest side of things that folks need to think about: forest conditions, ecological processes, site characteristics, disturbance stressors, but also in an actively managed forest, how will climate change affect timing of harvest, the equipment that you're going to use, right? Roads and access, logistics, who's going to do what, how will it happen, What's that going to look like as you're planning multiple years in ahead? And of course, the economics of that work, right? When we think about different ways and potentially different techniques, chop and drop, leaving some more wood on the forest floor, as we heard about this morning, different retention options, is that going to affect the bottom line? And that's really important, especially for private landowners, to know what the revenue will be and where that revenue will go. Can you turn it back into some restoration of that site? And so when we think about climate change, it's really important and really complex to think about the spatial variability, right? So if you're thinking about all these factors, how will climate change affect the forest and forest operations? That requires a knowledge of climate change impacts. And the thing we know about climate change, it's not consistent across the landscape. So a couple examples of this is extreme rainfall risk. We hear this all the time, risk of flooding, risk of extreme rainfall, but we know that this is going to happen in different parts of our region in different ways, right? So we see these projections of increased rainfall are not uniform across the landscape. And what we see for rainfall events, this middle graph, is the July rainstorms that we had here in Vermont and affected other parts of the region. And you see how variable that rainfall precipitation patterns were for the first half of July. And so we think about rainfall and extreme rainfall risk. We hear a lot about flooding, but really the majority of our forests, what is the biggest impact is erosion, right? So flooding will be an impact in bottomland forests, lowland forests, but really the impact will vary based on the size of the upslope watershed. How steep is that land? What are the soils like? How do they drain? And we know that things like complexity and ground conditions can really dictate the impacts from those events. And what's great is those last two are things that forest managers can tweak, right? Thinking about using silviculture and management techniques to enhance the complexity, that can increase the amount of infiltration you get when you have different forest strata, when you have more deadwood on the forest floor, when you have more complexity in the forest floor topography, that can really ameliorate some of the effects of extreme rainfall. We also see a lot of concern about risk from ice and wet snow events, which we know are a thing that we see in New England and projected potentially to increase with climate change when we have events that come right around freezing that can lead to snow loading in trees or ice loading. And we've seen some of those events this winter throughout the region. And so we see these patterns that, again, are not consistent across the landscape, right? There's some areas that are going to be more and some areas that are going to be less affected by these phenomenon. So we see the pattern of sort of mid and high elevations have experienced these ice and snow loading events more frequently. But if you think about the forest, especially at high elevations, they're much more resilient to that stressor. Conifers, our red spruce, balsam fir, can resist that loading a lot better than our hardwoods, our paper birch down in the mid elevations. So we do know that there's going to be a difference in risk based on the species at the site and tree form, depending on the impacts. And we see, for example, in our 98 ice storm, right, so that mid-elevation area was really the place where we saw the most extreme damage, but also there was an effect of aspect. So not all aspects are necessarily going to receive the same amount of ice and snow loading in an event. When we look at wind damage, this is something I've been talking to Jay Schaefer, who is a weather scientist here in Vermont in the Northeast Kingdom, and he's been doing a lot of work for this organization, Disaster Tech. They're trying to sort of model extreme weather events to sort of think about mitigating the effects of these events. So for power companies, they're really interested in sort of how will wind increase with climate change, and can they project where on the landscape will be most impacted? Unfortunately, it's very hard to look at trends in wind. And so this is something we don't have a lot of information on, is how will wind patterns change with climate change? But you can see in this map again, a lot of variability depending on the topography and the landscape position of that forest, and then that would translate into different risks across that landscape. When we look at, what sort of characteristics of the site are more prone to damages, we see things like shallower or poorly draining soils, going to be more likely to have tip-ups, exposure to prevailing winds, so just where that site is located relative to what wind patterns happen in the region. There are some complex relationships between the stand structure and wind damage, so we see things like when we have a large height to diameter ratio, so tall trees that are skinny, right? You all probably know this, often prone to snapping. But then some complex things, so we can see when we have a lot of crown ratio, so trees with a big crown, that's a big amount of weight, and so those trees can often come down. We also see the opposite when we have a small live crown ratio, often means those trees have small root structures. Those can also come down. So it does get complex with thinking about sort of site-specific risk from wind damage. Things like recent thinning or root rot on a site can certainly increase risk of wind damage. One example of this spatial variability with climate impacts or weather impacts was our May 18th freeze event that we had this past spring. So a lot of you probably saw this impact. It was pretty shocking to a lot of us that never really expected to see species like, oak be damaged by a frost event. And so it was really interesting. We had this early leaf out, so very, very warm spring allowed for species to leaf out early. And so the early leafing out species had fully developed leaves. So species like sugar maple really suffered very little damage versus the species that had the strategy of waiting for bud break and leaf development till more favorable conditions. We're in this really vulnerable stage where they were just leafing out. So we saw damage to sumac, American beech, oak species across some areas of the landscape. And when we looked at spatial patterns, so these are data from Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation Forest Health Team. They do some aerial surveys of damage. They did a very quick flyover, not of the whole state, and looked at where damage happened. It was really in these low-lying areas proximal to rivers. So this is where cold air sort of accumulated, and the trees suffered more damage in those places. So not exactly what you'd think of when you think of what areas would be more vulnerable to freezing damage. It wasn't the higher elevation areas. They hadn't leafed out. It was these low elevation areas where the cold air pooled. The other thing we're seeing that's pretty spatially variable is the risk of drought and heat stress. And so this is a figure showing what we have current number of hot days using the metric that's 86 degrees Fahrenheit, so 30 degrees Celsius. And this is our current number of days per year distribution across our region. And the projection for the end of the century is a lot more, right? So going from something like a week of hot days up to maybe a few weeks, few months of hot days per year. And that's a big change for us living in these areas, but it's a big change for the trees in those areas as well. Because one thing we do know about warmer air temperatures, warmer air can hold more water. So this does mean more evaporation of water from surfaces, from leaves, from soils. And so we're seeing potential, even though we're getting more rain, of potential for more drought. And one term that's sort of emerging to describe these are hot droughts. So it's that combination of hot temperatures that cause more evapotranspiration and lack of water. And so when we think about sort of vulnerability or risk of these conditions, certainly, compounding factors like south-facing slopes, drought-intolerant species or species that are less tolerant of drought might be more susceptible. And certainly, our youngest age classes, our seedlings that can't tap into deep water resources, are potentially going to be the most stressed. And we have seen in other years where we have drought in the summer, we see complete failure of cohorts of sugar maple, for example. and that is a potential risk of these increased conditions. And then, the other thing that we're seeing is that climate change is what we call a threat multiplier, right? So we already have these threats in our forests, insects and diseases. How will climate change then exacerbate those impacts? And how will it potentially mean we have different infestations or new infestations in locations we haven't had in the past? So, an example of that interaction is hemlock woolly adelgid, which has really been limited to sort of the southern, now a little bit the central part of our region because of its intolerance of really cold temperatures in the winter. As we see this past winter, pretty warm. We didn't have a lot of below zero temperatures in Vermont, which is really uncharacteristic for us. And we will likely see, I would imagine, higher survival rates of HWA in southern Vermont. And so, thinking about risk of these insect and disease outbreaks, of course, if you have a large presence of host species on the site, there's going to be potential more risk of damage, of impacts with that pest, and especially if that pest, if there's interactions between climate and that pest's vigor. Certainly factors that affect the stand, like low tree vigor, can potentially make that stand more prone to impacts. And thinking about sort of proximity to conduits and where those pests could move into that location. We're also expecting increased risk of invasive plants, as I mentioned. This is some work that's come out of UMass, where they do quite a bit of work on invasive plant modeling. And you can see in that graphic some places that we think of not having a lot of invasive plants, right? So Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, northern New Hampshire, northern Maine, that currently really don't have as many invasive plants as some other parts of the region, are projected to see an increase in invasive plant numbers in the future. So it's, just because you don't have invasive plants now doesn't mean in the next couple decades that will be the same. And so thinking about that risk of invasive plant infestation really has to do a lot with disturbances that happen on that site, proximity to conduits, sort of similar to invasive insects, conduits that will allow those plant seeds, propagules to get to that site. And so we do see things like deer and bird activity can be related to increased invasive plant infestations. And one other really important thing is going to be the change in deer populations that we'll see. And again, this is going to sort of mean that deer are likely going to be going northward, maybe into places that haven't had big deer populations before. And if we think about increased deer populations, those are going to have big effects on the regeneration and the composition of our forests in the future. And so we see from some research that's happened that, really that climate change is a big driver of white-tailed deer moving north. And that's really that combination of warm temperatures and lower snowpack will mean that they'll have new habitats in the future. Lots of folks are really interested in thinking about tree species specific risks to climate change. And so hopefully all of you are very aware of the Climate Change Tree Atlas, which is a great resource for thinking about species specific vulnerabilities, potential suitable habitat of those species in the future. But we do see that it's not uniform across the region, and it really does depend on where you exist, where your site is, relative to that species range. And so sometimes we have very big generalizations about which species are going to be future climate adapted, but it will really vary if you're in the northern part of New England versus central New England versus southern New England, and of course based on site characteristics, soils, and all the other factors that we think of that affect tree distributions and sort of compositions in our forests. So really where we see the most risk of stress of a certain tree species are going to be at the southern limits of that species range. So understanding where that species range is relative to the site of the forest is really important in thinking about that risk. But some other compounding factors, we see the south-facing sites just going to be warmer, right? Dry sites sites that might be marginal to that species is already going to be stressed, and you add climate change will compound that stress for that species. So really, one central concept about trees and how they die, generally they don't die of one singular cause, and I love this. This is adapted from Mannion's Tree Decline Concepts, which was a book published in 1980, which I really love because it talks about sort of this layering on of stressors to cause tree decline and mortality. And so thinking about that, right, like multiple stressors can really spiral and cause that mortality in a tree. And climate change, you'll see, is one of those stressors, right? So just baseline climate change, it might not look like the tree is stressed, but if that causes other physiological processes to change, can sort of make that tree more prone to insects and disease outbreaks, right? Lessen its ability to have stored carbohydrates to withstand or fight off infestations. One way that I really like communicating these tree species risks is using these great graphics from the climate change tree atlas. So I use this a lot when I talk to foresters and landowners to sort of describe what it means as a species is moving out of its range. And so this is showing balsam fir, which, our classic, really cold adapted species, loves high elevation, cold areas. And then this is its climate envelope, or its climate niche, and just showing mean temperature and precipitation for all the locations that it currently exists based on FIA plots. And so, just to illustrate this, and I find this helpful for landowners and foresters thinking about managing risk. So this is an example of Rutland County in Vermont, right? This is I pulled out their average annual temperature and average total precipitation from 1895 to 1970. And that's sort of where they line on that graph. And there is balsam fir in Rutland County. It's solidly part of its range. But when you look at the climate now in the last 30 years, you can see that it's shifting into that range where balsam fir still exists, but it's sort of getting to the edge of its climate envelope, right? And if you forecast that out with continued change, you can see that easily Rutland County as an average, as a total, may be outside where balsam fir exists currently based on those two attributes. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be a balsam fir in Rutland County. There's certainly going to be microclimates and areas that are higher elevation that deviate from this average temperature and precipitation. And the other thing that's really helpful to think about is that species have inherent adaptability to change. And so all species have different traits that can potentially help them adapt to these changes over time. And so the climate change tree atlas has defined these as biological traits and disturbance response traits. And so the biological traits are sort of seed dispersal, shade tolerance, aspects like that, where disturbance factors are, is it prone to deer browse, right? How does it respond to flooding? Is it resilient or tolerant of flooding? And together these give these adaptability scores for the species. And so we look at these, this isn't all the species we have in the region. I couldn't, you wouldn't be able to see it if I put them all on there. But just to illustrate, so what we get with these adaptability scores, it can help us sort of think about potential for these species to exist on the landscape and maybe some of our management applications. So we have on the lowest is black ash, right? It's really vulnerable to a number of insects and diseases, and has some other specific site characteristics that are really important for where it exists on the landscape. You all probably know that it's pretty hard to find locations with black ash. On the other side, probably won't come as a surprise either, highest adaptability score, red maple, right? It has a lot of things. It sprouts, does really well, it produces seed every year, right? It's pretty adaptable, can grow in swamps, it can grow in uplands. And so this can help us think about sort of that future condition and future of these species. And one I like to point out, because I think there's been a lot of maybe doom and gloom or sort of misunderstanding about, is sugar maple, right? It is a species that is certainly beloved here in Vermont. And we will see that in some locations it will be stressed because it does like sort of more mild climates, but it's quite adaptable. It has a lot of traits that will help it change in response to climate change. It also has a very big population, right? It exists in a lot of places. That means a lot of genetic diversity. And so sugar maple is one that we potentially will see variability across our landscape due to climate change. So one way that I like to communicate this sort of vulnerability assessment is I divide by strata. This is really helpful, I found, for landowners to think about. So I divide this into sort of overstory conditions, understory conditions of future forest, and then land ground conditions, thinking about hydrology, nutrient cycling. And so I've created these sort of different site level characteristics that can help landowners, foresters, really think about vulnerabilities in these 3 different strata. And so this is modeled after NIACS, has some similar ways to look at this, and sort of factors that increase vulnerability, factors that decrease vulnerability. And obviously, they're gonna stack upon each other, and this is sort of just a guiding framework to think about vulnerability. So things like tree condition, right? How healthy do the trees look? How big are the crowns? Structure, right? So thinking about trees that are very close together, similar size, diversity of the species present in the forest. Are the species that are present suitable to the future climate, right? Are they projected to do well based on the climate change tree atlas? And of course, things like insect and disease damage. Are we seeing that there's an outbreak or a proximal outbreak? And so, examples that I found really helpful to show landowners, and this is something that, a lot of landowners have forests that look like this, right? Old field white pine, all one age, one species, and framing it in a vulnerability context can be really helpful to think about why you do management on that parcel, on that stand, right? Invasive understory, no regeneration. You get a disturbance that comes through there, or pest. That forest might not remain a forest, actually, after that disturbance, if there's no future forest to come in. Then looking at that forest understory strata, right? Again, things like invasive plants, evidence of browse pressure or effects of browse pressure on the species diversity, thinking about regeneration amount and diversity, and then also in that strata, the suitability of regeneration to the future climate. And we see things like this, right? Second growth oak hemlock stand. This is actually in South Burlington, surrounded by farmland and development. Really no understory to speak of, except you can see in the background, get some invasive species coming in. And then the last strata are the nutrients and hydrology component. And this does get missed by a lot of landowners. They don't think, they just look at the trees. And so having them look down and think about the ground conditions is really, really important to think about risk and vulnerability. So things like obvious erosion that's happening. Are there areas of exposed soil not covered in leaf litter? Is there deadwood on the forest floor? This is often missed on many parcels in our woods. And then thinking about infrastructure, drainages, how well they can keep up with increased rainfall events. And certainly things like hydrology, are there impediments to the hydrologic functioning of that stand? And so, examples like this is pretty common in Vermont, and I'm sure across our region, of incised streams, right? From just decades of erosion, or legacy roads that are really acting as conduits when we do see high rainfall events. And these really are vulnerabilities when we get events like we had this July. These legacy roads and these incised streams really transported water quite quickly. And so I just wanted to end with a couple tools that I use, online tools, to think about climate and think about this variability across space. One of my favorites is Climate at a Glance, which is by NOAA. And so for this, you can look at state level, county level data. It won't project in the future, but you can look at trends. So that red line is a trend line. And it's really great in thinking about specific changes that are happening in your neck of the woods. The other tool I really like is the Northeast Regional Climate Center. Again, you can sort of look at spatial variability, not as long time frames as climate at a glance, but allows you to sort of look at some different metrics, including snowfall, which can be really helpful when we're thinking about frozen ground conditions. And then the last one I'll just highlight for thinking about risk of insects and diseases is this Forest Service National Insect and Disease Risk Map. It is based on model data, so these are not actually where the risk will necessarily happen, but it helps you look at, so for example, this is hemlock woolly adelgid, risk of loss of basal area and stands in the future, and it helps you think about how proximal you are from current infestations of this insect to potential impacts on the forest stand structure. And that's what I got. UVM Extension Forestry, I'm always happy to hear from folks if you want to reach out or have other ideas about risk and threats assessment in our forest. Thank you. I guess probably have time for questions.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you, Allie. Bear with me for just a minute. I need to open up the next presentation.